Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio online lunchtime talk, which for the very first time in a very long while is live from the studio. We're not open to the public yet, but we do hope to be so in the near future. And for the time being, these talks are live online on YouTube every Friday at 1 p.m, beaming out onto your smartphones, laptops, iPads, and living room TVs. My name's Luke and I'm the Pervasive Media Studio. These talks are our chance to throw open the digital doors of the Pervasive Media Studio and for you to hear more from the people who are part of our community or who are working on things that excite us. An especially big welcome for any of you out there who are new.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media
Studio. I forgot to mute myself. It's been a year. These things still happen. As I was saying, especially big welcome to those of you who are new to the studio, for whom this might be the first time you're engaging with us. And for any of you out there who are new to us, here's a little bit more about what we do. The studio is a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We're a partnership between Watershed, University of the West of England, and the University of Bristol, and we're a home for early ideas, companies, and a meeting place of both creative and commercial industries. We're a studio space, offering desk space, meeting rooms, events, and opportunities, all for free to our residents. And we make a safe place for artists to take risks in their practice and make time for collaboration. This week's talk is by one of our residents, Tim Kindberg, and it's called AI Politics. In the latest of his excellent For Skeptics series, Tim is going to return to the subject of AI, both as an instrument of power and as a provocation to the imagination. He's even promised to debunk artificial dogs. There will be a Q&A at the end, with the talk running at roughly 40 minutes. If you want to ask any questions, just pop them into the chat window and I'll pick them out. Or if you'd like, you can tweet us your questions at PM Studio UK. And please feel free to share this link now. We're live and it's always a case of more the merrier when we do these broadcasts. A captioned and recorded version of the talk will also be available here after the talk is finished. Before we start, there's no talk next week as we are taking a short break, but you can get news on our next talk, which is on Friday the 25th of June, and all our future talks by following us on Twitter at PM Studio UK or on Instagram at Pervasive Media Studio, or subscribing to our newsletter on our website. Don't forget, while you're sat there listening to me talk, to hit subscribe on this YouTube channel so you don't miss out on all our latest content. And while you're there, give the video a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get, the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Now, I'm going to hand you over to Tim.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can see me. Thanks, Luke. Yes, I'm going to give you another For Skeptics talk today. It's going to feature not only artificial dogs, but also vampires and Dido Harding. And it's going to be about AI. So, Martin, if you could show this first slide, please. So, AI politics. This is a For Skeptics presentation. For those of you who haven't been to one of these before, my goal is to have a look at the essence of a major technology, to think about how what it's actually good for, as opposed to what people might say it's good for, and to look at the people behind it and the corporations, the organizations behind that technology, and to look at it from a skeptical point of view. And also from the point of view of a creative reaction to that technology. So, AI, as I'm sure many people in the audience recognize, raises a great many ethical issues, that is to say, issues of right and wrong. And to name probably the main issues in that category, there are questions of bias and social justice, questions of workplace welfare and jobs, surveillance and privacy, environment, democracy and public affairs, and threats to life. And all of these have very pressing issues to do with right and wrong. And one of the interesting things is how AI ethics has risen as a great concern. But one of the things that I'm not so sure about with the topic of AI ethics is whether it really addresses the fundamental question that we are faced with. The woman in that slide is Timnit Gebru, who was fired by Google. She's an artificial intelligence researcher. She was fired by Google, and she accused Google in response of silencing marginalized voices. So there you have an individual Black woman who feels that her corporation, massively powerful corporation, was having an unjust response to her own criticisms of that corporation. And this is a quote from Kate Crawford, whose book, Atlas of AI, was published recently. She's referring to what she terms these cul-de-sac conversations, where terms like ethics and AI for good have been so completely denatured of any actual meaning. She's referring to the gloss that corporations put on this. I hope it pulls aside the curtain and says, let's actually look at who's running the levers of these systems. That means shifting away from just focusing on things like ethical principles to talking about power. And I feel very sympathetic to that view, that that's what we should be talking about. That's why this is a talk on AI politics and not on AI ethics. And my questions that I'm going to look at in this talk are, firstly, how effective and exploited an instrument of power is AI currently? And secondly, what does the future hold? And let's start with the future, because in the collective imagination, the future is already here. We see films of AI in science fiction films, and not even necessarily completely science fiction films. We read science fiction. It's constantly on our TV screens, etc. A conception of AI is already here. And in fact, I also have contributed to that because part of what I do is I write, and I've recently released this book, Vampires of Avonmouth, which is set in the relatively near future, 2087, set between the West Africa and the West Country. And there are two principal technologies which I explore the ramifications on in this book. Yes, it does have vampires in it, but there's a theme here. The two technologies I mostly look at are AI, which I'm going to talk about, and also brain internet connections. The idea that instead of having to have a mobile phone, I would have a direct connection between my own mental activity and the internet. I could compose a message and send it to you without touching a device. And if you think that's totally crazy, Elon Musk thinks it's 5 years away. Now, that's a typically, in my view, technically uninformed opinion by Elon Musk, has to be said. But there are people working on that platform right now. And it's about this book, about what I'm describing as the vampiric nature of technology platforms. That is to say that they take something from us, and that's what I'm going to be looking at. It's about a struggle for humanity against systems of oppression, which are made possible in large part by those technical platforms. Those systems of oppressions. It also looks at oppression as a part of our own selves, which is a slightly more existential aspect of this. And just to read a very small extracts from the book to give you a flavor. A module swooped from above, sleek and highly maneuverable. The chief climbed out. A chief. For this one was not flesh, but a bodai, an artificial eye assigned to a bod, the bod to a module, the module dispatched to David, and consequently to this node. Anyway, there it was. I need your report ASAP. You'll have it today. David deliberately looked as though he didn't mean it, a casual and common expression of fleshly descent that had stayed with him from his youth. So in this conception, I don't call them robots, although actually some characters in the book still call them robots, but I call them bodais. It's a bod plus an AI, and there's a rather fluid relationship, as I'll explain, between a bod, which is the physical manifestation of an artificial intelligence, and the particular artificial intelligence which currently happens to be operating that bod. The other thing is there's a huge sense of alienation here because these bodais are around us all the time. They're a physical manifestation of the network, which is essentially in the background as artificial intelligences. which is manipulating these bodhis that are in our world all around us. And we're kind of an equal with them. You have the network, and then you have the flesh work. We are the flesh work. We are essentially reduced to flesh by the operations of the techno-dystopian authority that's in this world. Nonetheless, David, the main character in the book, has to operate with these creatures, but he defies it, and there is a kind of insolence towards them. There is still a spirit there. The pause was just a timing routine, a ruse to slow them down so they could talk to flesh and not freak flesh out with sheer speed. David sensed this one might be a little iffy on the network to flesh work interface. Give me headlines, it said. Much passes over the heads of these creatures. They are artificial intelligences, but they're not so bright, and they don't get a lot about human behavior. And that is very much my portrayal of these. This is the rather wonderful Hiroshi Ishiguro, the roboticist. And I love this picture because I've just taken two. He likes to pose with pictures of his bodhis. He is flesh. He has bodhis around him. On the left, you see a picture of him with a replica of him. I'm pretty sure he's the one on the right. I'm not quite sure. I think the flesh guy is on the right and the bodhi is on the left. But when I say that, I then look at the picture on the right, and I assume that's him, the flesh guy, but he looks more like the bodhi one in the left to me. So I'm not quite sure. But he surrounds himself with these bodhis, and it's a kind of current incarnation of what happens in the book. Imagine that actually he has bodhis all around him, but they have the same AI operating them all the time. So all these characters are actually the same personality. They just have different embodiments in my conception of this. And the fact that the network actually dispatches AIs to bodies is a kind of symbol of its power to do such a thing, which is way beyond any human capability. And I'm not going to cover all the masses of literature and films there are about this, but there are two. It typically is the case that artificial intelligences are massively intelligent, unlike my conception of them, where they're dodgily not very intelligent. You have everything from the vision on the left, which is that these are so intelligent, they're more intelligent than us, and their goal is to make us their slaves. You have the vision, for those of you who haven't read Kazuo Ishiguro's recent novel, on the right. There's a conception of them as servants. He has artificial friends who are there to serve us. They are conscious, they believe in rather strange things, but they're conscious and intelligent, and they are there just to serve us. You have those, that you often see these two kind of issues raised of, are they going to destroy us, or are they sentient beings that actually we're taking for granted and we should give them equal rights to us? You often have those two. But in fact, we're nowhere near the position where one could even have to think about such things, because they're not intelligent. What we have at the moment, as I'm going to argue. So back to the present. Who is behind the current AI technologies, and what power can they wield with them? That's Francis Bacon, to whom the phrase knowledge is power is attributed. He was alive, for those of you who don't know, in the 16th and 17th centuries. He crossed between those two centuries. And he is a man who is credited with playing a large part in the foundation of scientific principles. He coined this phrase, knowledge is power. Actually, I don't think he ever quite used that phrase, but he used something like it in Latin. And for him, knowledge was two things. One was the knowledge of God. God, of course, the omniscient creature by definition, who has massive power by virtue of being omniscient, by knowing everything. But on a mundane level, as a progenitor of the scientific method, Francis Bacon wanted to achieve action in the world. And therefore he wanted to understand cause and effect. And he wanted to really understand those things empirically. And that's how he got to be, and that's knowledge that he wanted. And he saw that as power, because if you knew cause and effect, you could take action in the world, and that would be a powerful thing. But let's take a 21st century take on that. What about data? Is data power then, if knowledge is power? It's kind of interesting to me that I'm not sure people use it so much anymore, but remember when the phrase data is the new oil had currency? And it was data, wasn't it? It wasn't knowledge. They didn't say knowledge is the new oil, but all we need is knowledge, and that knowledge is the thing we can commodify, and it's the most powerful thing we can imagine. It's data. And I'm going to argue that's a very telling thing, because data is not knowledge. It's what some people hope is a shortcut to knowledge. In fact, I'm going to argue that machine learning, which is the principal technology used behind artificial intelligence at the moment, is what I describe as an epistemological black hole. I'm sorry to use highfalutin language like this, but it's what the philosophers call it's the bit of philosophy where we discuss and argue about how we acquire knowledge. What is knowledge and how do we acquire it? And I'm going to argue that machine learning is the opposite of acquisition of knowledge. Here are 3 cases where there is an attempt made to gain knowledge about the world. Slap bang in the middle of that is us. I'm sorry to have abstracted with rather weird diagrams, us, but that's us. You have the world, the physical world that we inhabit. You have us with our brains and with our senses. And the interesting thing about us being in the world is that the world kind of hands us data on a plate. It pushes data at us all the time. It sends light to us, it sends sounds to us, it sends motion to us, it sends heat to us, and we're constantly handed data by the universe as beings in that universe. And it goes through our senses, and that data is what the philosophers would call sense data, which is kind of the most elemental ways that we gather information about the world. And obviously we have our brains, which we're using now, and I'm talking very abstractly to all of you with your brains, and I'm communicating, I hope, to you. And we've got this amazing thing going on right via our brains. And I'm communicating to you my take on epistemology. And this is all happening via our brains and our senses. On the right is science. Now, work needs to be done with science to acquire data. Data does not get handed to science by the universe. Work needs to be done. As a scientist, you need to measure the universe. You need to measure the length of things, the mass of things, the speed of things, the electrical charge of things and everything. You need to do work. And that measurement isn't just hard labor, it's actually theory-bound intellectual work that needs to be done to gather the data. And then we feed that data into our hypotheses and theories about how the world works. And there we have symbolic representations of our knowledge. We have equations that we've written down. We have descriptions that we've written down about all the things we know about the physical universe. And they're written down for all of us to understand, to critique, to prove it's wrong, to try and find evidence that it's right. And this is a first-class thing for us as human beings to discuss and relate to. Now let's look at machine learning, or AI, on the left. This is completely fundamentally different. Okay, the kind of zeroth assumption of artificial intelligence, I'm not saying everybody believes this who works in that field, is that you don't have to do any work. We're swimming in data. Data's there. It's handed to us by the tech universe, on a plate. We're swimming in data. All we've got to do is sample it, put it into a statistical model, and Bob's your uncle. So it's fundamentally different in the way that it views how knowledge is to be acquired. It's not actually knowledge per se, it's data which we're swimming in. And the epistemological assumption is that in statistics, and it is all statistics by and large, you can elicit knowledge from that data. So completely different. But I'll just elaborate a bit more about how it's different, actually. If I take a picture of my cat, I have not measured my cat. I have not measured anything about the essence of my cat. I have merely sampled the corner of the universe in which my cat sits, and I've gathered the pixel values, the colors of that corner of the universe, and I've stuffed it in a file as ones and zeros. There is no catness in those ones and zeros. I have not taken any steps to measure anything about the cat just by taking a picture of it. And yet a lot of artificial intelligence will try and work from that unmeasured, sampled piece of data. You've probably heard a lot about attempts to recognize people's faces and to understand what emotions they're expressing at the time. And in the images, measurements are taken. But this again is interesting when you compare it to the scientific method, because these are measurements without a theory. There is no theory that links measurements of points on my face with anything about me, okay? Not about my gender, not about my sexuality, and not about my current state of emotion. There is no theory that establishes that relationship. It's pure, wishful, magical thinking that one can do statistics on this and have something that's remotely like knowledge. If we look at the statistical model, and I should make it absolutely clear here, when I say a statistical model, I'm not talking about the wonderful scientific statistical models of the propagation of COVID-19, for example. That is a scientifically grounded mathematical model of the spread of the virus around our countries, our world. And it's a scientific artifact. It's also statistical. This is not a scientific artifact. It is some statistics run against data, and it is realized as code and data. There are no equations, there's no theory, there's nothing of the sort. So there's not a theory, as in science, it's not a concept, as in a human being, and in fact, it's not anything explicable. I'm always amazed by people who talk about explainable AI, because it seems to me that as a matter of logic, there is no such thing. And if anybody wants to persuade me, please ask me in the question. It's not explicable. It is a relationship between values in a statistical matrix, that's all. And the other thing to say about it is not only is it inexplicable, it has unknowable, and I do mean unknowable, error modes. You can only find out what errors it's capable of when it manifests those errors. You could never predict in advance what errors it's capable of. It's kind of interesting to do a thought experiment. It's a bit dystopian, this one. Imagine that we've totally blown ourselves up, okay? Nuclear war, we're just rubble. There's no human civilization left. The only thing, actually in my book, I have all the data. It's in an era of global warming. All the data centers are at the two poles of the planet. And let's imagine that the data centers survive. There's nothing else. All there is the hard drives in the data center. Imagine that aliens send a probe to our planet, too late because we're not there anymore, and all they find is the hard drives. Can they reconstruct our civilization from those hard drives? They can do some things. I mean, they'd figure out pretty quickly how we represent numbers. we'd probably figure out pretty quickly how we represent coordinates. They'd probably find some 3D models in there and be able to sort of reconstruct 3D models from it and things. They'd have some idea, but there is absolutely no way that they could reconstruct our civilization from that, no matter how much data we generate from now and then, because the data at the end of the day is ones and zeros. It is not meaning. So my position, this is where we get to the dog bit. My position is that this fellow here is more intelligent than any software that exists by far. This fellow can actually solve some open-ended problems. This fellow has something, is equipped with something very like what AI, as it currently is incarnated, does actually. It's got an acute sense of smell. And there's recently been reported there's been quite a lot of research about dogs being extremely accurate in training them to smell COVID on people. And dogs actually, well, I don't know how extensive these trials were, but in the trials they showed looked very good. AI, on the other hand, has not contributed to the fight against COVID. It's proved incapable of finding anything that we've heard about that's useful in all those statistics. And why do we think AI is so wonderful then? It's because, I argue, of what I call the robotic fallacy, because we make a basic mistake when we hear about anything that AI does. That mistake is to mistake an instance of seemingly intelligent behavior for the existence of an underlying faculty of intelligence. You see a robot, you hear it say something amazing, you think, well, it must be intelligent, but actually it's not capable of doing anything much more than saying that one amazing thing. Here, for some of you may have across the kind of state of the art in what I'm talking about. That's a piece of software called GPT-3. So I'll just quickly read, in case you can't read this very well on the screen, a little bit of its output. It is a curious fact that the last remaining form of social life in which the people of London are still interested is Twitter. I was struck with this curious fact when I went on one of my periodical holidays to the seaside and found the whole place twittering like a starling cage. I called it an anomaly, and it is. Amazing. Must be super intelligent, right? This example is due to Barry Marcus. He starts out description of a setup and he lets it continue. You're having a small dinner party. You want to serve dinner in the living room. The dining room table is wider than the doorway. So to get it into the living room, you will have to, and it says, remove the door. You have a table saw, so you cut the door in half and remove the top half. So there is no understanding, literally no understanding in GPT-3. It's being manifested. You can ask it the most basic thing that involves most basic amount of arithmetic you want or whatever. It will get it wrong unless it's quirkily gets it right. Also, the bits that you see that seem remarkable are completely cherry-picked. It mostly comes up with nonsense. It's an example of statistical text weaving. It's being fed a huge corpus of human text. And by the way, it's a bit like, for those of you who remember Tay Tweets, which Microsoft brought out as a chatbot, supposedly intelligent chatbot, turned out to be a racist chatbot because it just echoed all the rubbish that people fed to it. And removing all the bias and the things that go against our social justice values in this amazingly large corpus of text would involve either an unfeasible amount of human labor or an AI, which it would have to work, and they don't work. They're incapable of this level of understanding. Come back to epistemology and the labor of it. Cats are understood by vets, biologists, pet owners, dogs. I suspect cat owners will disagree with all of this actually, but that knowledge is human labor. The acquisition of that knowledge is human effort and labor and inventiveness and creativity. which some capitalists would rather not pay for. And here we get to the promised Guido Harding slide, because there's a kind of culture of this in the corporate and governmental echelons, if you like. There's a kind of a culture of not needing to know it, not needing to have the domain knowledge. Let's think about Guido Harding. What did she have a background in? Telecoms, supermarkets. Gosh, who can we think of to put at the head of our £37 billion public health initiative, Track and Trace? Let's have someone who knows about telecoms and supermarkets, shall we? And I think there is a certain mentality here, and I've seen it many times in my own life when I've encountered CEOs, for example, that everything looks like a spreadsheet in that culture. It doesn't look like an intricate, problematic, issue-bound domain of knowledge, which we only know imperfectly, by the way. It actually looks like a spreadsheet. So let's talk about power. And this is a slide from, as some of you will remember, not so long ago, last year, when poor kids couldn't take their exams because of COVID. So the government thought it'd be great to have an algorithm that would determine exam results. And there was a justified outcry about this because it was a completely naff, ill-founded algorithm that didn't take into account the domain knowledge of the teachers who know all about how to assess students. There is a relationship of power here, because if you're going to deploy an algorithm against the populace, then you are actually exerting your power over that populace, or attempting so to do. And we could name lots of entities that might be exerting such said power. You can obviously think of China and Russia. There's no question but that these are surveillance states that seek to control their populations in various ways. You can argue a lot of the same stuff about our country and the United States as well, which certainly have an enormous amount of surveillance going on, and which seek, for example, to determine what is free speech and what isn't free speech. Obviously, it's a no-brainer that tech companies exert a huge amount of power in here, both in the surveillance of us and also in the exercise of artificial intelligence, which, as we've seen in so many cases, has an impact on our democracy, on whether or not we're all going to get vaccinated because of the existence of fake news. Really important questions. Maybe there's even questions about our local authorities. I put Avon and Somerset Constabulary and Bristol City Council there. I did bother to look up what Avon and Somerset Constabulary said about facial recognition. In respect of covert use of automatic facial recognition, Avon and Somerset Constabulary can neither confirm nor deny that information is or is not held by virtue of blah, blah, blah. And then there are kind of the smaller fry, the insurance companies that are seeking to evaluate us and can't be bothered to do the work of properly evaluating us, so they get an algorithm to do it badly. Or recruitment agencies which can't be bothered to understand who we are and what we might bring to a job, and would rather do a text-based search against our CVs. I was talking to someone just the other day who's trying to defeat those algorithms, spends his time trying to defeat those algorithms with his CV. So if you come back to my picture of the machine learning setup, for the acquisition of data, we can look at that as an act of surveillance. And there's also this path backwards of potentially, I'm not saying this always happens, by the way, of control and exploitation. In the case of surveillance, this is a graph from 2019. China obviously is hugely up on surveillance. I lived in Guangzhou for 2 months, by the way, and they don't just do camera-based surveillance. They actually have people sitting in little huts on so many street corners, also looking at what's going on. London's in there, it's not that far down. and mysteriously Atlanta in the US, I'm not quite sure what it is about Atlanta in the US, also gets into the top 10. But these are enormous numbers of cameras trained on us. And what are they there for? Well, then they're not for, you know, a human being to look at a screen with masses of feeds. It's for software, of course, to look at. And so we get into software like this, which is to come back to our theoryless measurement and theoryless non-acquisition of knowledge. There are measurements taken against the image, and there are ill-founded conclusions drawn about the age, the gender, and the emotional state of this person in this particular case. And I'm not saying very often it won't be right. It will be right very often. This isn't just totally not working software, but it's not based on any theory, and it will be wrong, and it'll be wrong in reasons which are not known by the people who couldn't really be bothered to have a theory about the data in the first place. There's the whole question of the materiality of AI. We think of AI as, you know, existing off in the cloud service somewhere. But there's this wonderful, some of you I'm sure will know this, it's by Kate Crawford, who I mentioned earlier, and someone else who I've forgotten the name of. If you look up anatomy of an AI system, you'll find this. It's really fascinating. This is an Amazon Echo Dot, you know, the smart speaker. And this is everything to do with the creation of that and the functioning of that artifact. And it's from everything to do with the rare earth minerals that are mined, involving the exploitation of people around the world, and which have massive effects on pollution in the construction of said device, all the way to the algorithms that are used to recognize your speech. And when I say recognize, to turn it into text, because it's not understood in any meaningful sense, and which then used to trigger the responses of the device to you. And there's a whole cascade of aspects of how this device, it's a wonderful study, I think, a whole cascade of the embedding of this artificial intelligent device in our material world. And I've referred to labor there, and, you know, obviously we are all doing work for these corporations all the time, right? Because we're all on our phones, clicking buttons, scrolling all the time. We are throwing data in a way that they don't have to pay for, broadly speaking, at the corporations and at governments and at other sorts of organizations. We're hooked, and they learn with theoryless acquisition of what we're up to. Our labor, thankfully not mine, but that of many people, is embedded in an algorithmically augmented space. That's an Amazon dispatch warehouse. Everything that woman does is controlled via algorithms, and she's constantly being prompted to keep up to pace with the algorithm. She is a cog in an algorithmic machine, by and large. She's not exercising her creativity or her judgment. She's fulfilling a role in a creative machine. And obviously some warehouses do away with the person altogether because they can actually manage to get robots to do it. The training of machine learning algorithms is done partly by us, of course, when we do captures, because some of the pictures in a capture will be known about already, and some of them won't. And the ones that aren't, when we say, you know, there's a traffic light in there or something, we're actually helping train an AI. But mostly the work of training AIs is by people taking images or pieces of text or whatever it is and so-called labeling it to help the AI classify it. And that is very poorly paid work done typically by people in the third world. So is data power? Well, it's not knowledge, and AI is being deployed without the acquisition of knowledge. That's my central argument here, but it's still being deployed anyway, because statistically it sometimes works enough for the deploying entity to feel satisfied with it, even if it's not at all satisfactory from anyone else's point of view. Since I've argued, well, I'm sure most of you know this by now anyway, surveillance, it has an impact on our labor. It has influence over our public affairs through our elections and distortions of the content fed to us while we're thinking about who to vote for, life-changing decisions in relation to weapons that are being deployed. Driverless cars, of course, is more or less running to the ground because they just can't do it, but there is still a question of autonomous vehicles and whether they're safe. But there's also a kind of slightly more subtle, I think, more existential angle to this, that this conception of AI, which is not, as I've argued, a very humble thing that has flaws in many, many departments, but is this sort of science fictional, amazingly powerful thing. It casts a technological shadow over our humanity, partly because of our labor and obviously the forms of labor that we are able to do. That's a hugely important part about our lives. But it's also this idea that our minds could be replaced by machines. Now, I've argued not only that there's certainly cannot be replaced by machines currently, and I would argue we have no idea how to replace them with machines. There literally is no idea in the entire research community about how to do that yet. There's just some vague ideas, not a concrete idea that would take us there. The other thing to say is that the practice of AI is getting more and more shoddy, actually. This is a recent tweet. There's a recent paper from the University of Cambridge who looked at a bunch of papers asserting the efficacy of AI in clinical settings. You must have often heard this. It's often propounded, this idea that you don't need radiographers anymore. You just have an AI that looks at people's x-rays, for example. And it actually finds, well, it says here, machine learning is facing a credibility crisis. Papers rely on limited or low quality data, fail to specify their training approach and statistical methods, and don't test whether they will work for people of different races, genders, ages, and geographies. Every single one was fatally flawed, according to the study from Cambridge. So, unfortunately, data is power, but it's the wrong sort of power. It's not Francis Bacon's power. Francis Bacon's power is based on knowledge, not on data. This is not knowledge. This is what works statistically. It's a sort of convenience. It is exploited. It's exploited in our elections. It's exploited in the clickbait algorithms. Lots of things we could mention. It's exploited in current hiring practices, insurance practices, all the rest of it. What does the future hold? Well, the portrait I paint in my book is that it's an appalling world where we surrendered our humanity to these algorithms. And they're all rubbish algorithms. So we've surrendered our humanity and we have this amazingly crap world that we're living in. Okay. And the future needs to be redefined according to the actual incapability of machine learning, not the fantasy of what artificial intelligence could be. We all need to somehow educate ourselves, I think, about how crap it is. And it needs to be founded on regulation, especially given how crap it is. And it needs to be founded on our creative response to how crap it is by taking the piss out of it, frankly. And that is exactly where I end up. So if you're interested in my book, plug at the end, it's available in good bookshops in Bristol or online. And thank you all for your attention. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Tim, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to hear your take on things like this. There's a few questions popping in the chat already. And whilst I clear my throat, I just wanted to ask one question because I'm interested when the skeptics talks are always really good dives beneath the hyperbole and the PR of a lot of what we experience when technology is talked about on the surface level. And I wonder if your kind of argument that AI and robotics, like AI specifically, isn't a form of intelligence. Like, does it need to be a form of intelligence for AI and future robotics to cause us problems?
No, I agree with you. Actually, I'm talking about AI, but I could have been talking about automation, and automation doesn't need to be intelligent at all. It could be quite sort of deterministic, and it would still cause us problems because it's still redefining our jobs and everything. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad you asked that. That's a good point. I also, I tend to sort of launch in on the putting the opposing point of view to the way that AI is so hyped. I don't want to say that all these clever people working in AI are wasting their time, because I don't believe that's true. I mean, there is a benign form of these technologies. They are rather humble in my opinion, and I completely welcome people trying to create intelligence out of digital software. I just don't think I've seen anybody who has a plausible way of doing it. But I'm happy to be proved wrong about that.
Yeah, great, thank you. And there's a slight muffling going on the sound on your mic. I don't know if you've just put a hand over it up. That's better.
Yeah, I haven't done anything. Okay.
So our very own creative technologist Martin O'Leary asks, you're making a strong argument that machine learning is unscientific, but why does that mean it's epistemologically invalid? I tried. Don't we need to hold spaces for alternative routes to knowledge? Question.
Well, yes, but that's not one of them, because it's a tool in the human acquisition of knowledge. Because one thing I would say is that you can use a machine learning program to make manifest a pattern in underlying data, which we perhaps wouldn't have got just by thinking about it or by running plain old statistical models. So I'm not saying that it can't help us, but it of itself is not a technology that can acquire knowledge, because that statistical model box that I drew is a black box. It has no internal architecture that can explain to us anything about the world. So it's not explanatory, and that, to my mind, is not knowledge.
Rod Dickinson says, "Hi Tim, brilliant talk." Rod's asked two questions, so I'm going to get one in first, and if there's time, we'll get the second one in. Do you think there really is a claim that machine learning produces knowledge?
I really don't, because there's nothing in those. If you think about the way deep learning, which is the main technology we're talking about, there are other sorts of statistics. And obviously there's something called symbolic AI as well, which sort of famously failed as the first approach to AI. A lot of people are talking about hybrids between symbolic and so-called connectionist AI. So you take machine learning, you take the original approach, which is basically where you write a program with rules in it that you think are going to embody some epistemological principles, and you put the two together. Both of them have failed to produce epistemologically sound systems, but maybe if you put the two together is the latest thinking. And I don't know that that's not true. But I've not seen anything apart from essentially hand waving that it can be done. And the thing I always remind myself is that the thing inside here is not software, it's not digital, it's chemistry. And none of us knows what the implications of that are. But the deep learning systems that we have are extremely crude representations. They're called artificial neural nets, extremely crude representations of the chemistry that happens in here, which has thousands of different types of neurons with all kinds of chemical processes going on in them. Okay, and don't say, but we can always digitize that, because that's a non sequitur. I can digitize the operation of a nuclear power plant in my laptop. That does not mean that I have a nuclear power plant in my laptop. Okay.
Very good. A. Abbott says, as a consumer, I can ignore conventional advertising, but I'm highly influenced by the shopping opportunities offered by Amazon and the pop-up ads on Google. Do you feel that their algorithms are too powerful?
That's an interesting question, whether they are really, whether they really work, because obviously they're advertising it us all the time, and the algorithms are constantly rearranging the order of things all the time in order to have certain effects on us, which is typically advertising. But I don't know, to be honest with you, I probably should know this, I don't know that they really work for us. I personally only really noticed them where they seemed to know stuff about me that I didn't think they had any basis for knowing. But so I don't think I can very helpfully answer that question, but I think we're better off ignoring it, is all I could say.
Well, maybe we need to get you back to do a advertising and algorithms for skeptics.
Yes.
So another question from Martin. Do you think that sci-fi writers have a responsibility for presenting AI as more competent than it is, acting as propaganda for the powerful forces that deploy it?
No, I think it's fine for writers to write whatever the hell they like, frankly. We must write whatever the hell we like. I think it's for the rest of us to kind of educate ourselves about the state. And I think it's fine. When I talk about what's happening, I don't believe any of the technologies that I posit in my book will actually be available in 28.7. Neither the degree of AI, although it's rubbish, even that degree I don't think will be there in 28.7. I also don't think we'll have brain internet connections and anything like that time scale. But I was able to use that with a somewhat inflated view of those technologies to explore what might still happen. And also it's a framing for questions about our humanity, isn't it? I mean, that certainly was my motivation. I think a lot of writers do it for that reason. It's a framing for thinking about our humanity. I'm sure that's what Kazuo Ishiguro was doing. I don't want to compare myself to him, but I'm sure that's what he was doing. Yeah.
Well, sticking on the book then, because there's another question about the book, which is handy, right? A.A. Abbott says your book, Vampires of Avonmouth, is really scary. How do we avoid a world like that?
By being, by the things I mentioned towards the end of my talk there, I think, by being skeptical, by not believing the hype, and by realizing that this software is being rolled out despite its inadequacies, and to regulate the hell out of it.
It's that easy.
No, it's very difficult. But I mean, those are the only things we can do. Right? I mean, obviously there are political means to lobby politicians about it, but I just tried to indicate with Dido Harding, I could have extrapolated that argument to our current government, right? That's a government that has very little domain knowledge about anything. Right? I mean, there's a culture in certain classes of our society of not needing to know very much about anything, because you're supremely confident and you get by with just that.
And that might well be the theme for another talk.
Yes.
Viral Info asks, could you say how sense data in networks fits into your theory?
Yeah, so interesting. Sense data, I don't think it does fit in my theory as such. Philosophers can argue for centuries about these questions, right? The picture I have in my middle, where I blithely made assertions like the universe throws data at us, and that appears as sense data, which our minds can then take hold of and subject to our reasoning or our intuitions or whatever. There's a million philosophers who probably argue with me about that. The distinction I wanted to draw is that we nonetheless are to talk about those things and to argue about them and to reason about them. So, it puts those into our symbolic realm of language and being able to talk about things which aren't quite true, which it certainly isn't true of machine learning. I think I've forgotten the second bit of that question, but that was the sense data bit anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty bang on.
Okay.
Tim Corkerton asks, or says, all societies and cultures have evolved with their own sets of prejudices. Don't you think that it's inevitable that AI will evolve its own set of prejudices?
Well, I don't. when you say when one says evolves its own, I think it might, that GPT-3, I'm sure, can make new expressions that are prejudicial and which no human has yet uttered. I'm sure that's true. But again, there's no reasoning or conceptualization or theory in GPT-3. There is no understanding. One of the interesting things you can ask is, could we develop an AI that, instead of being fed data by humans, which is what we do now, could actually choose its own data to feed it? Because currently that doesn't happen. But currently, by and large, AIs get trained very specifically with data that we decide what that data is, and give it to the AI, which then learns from it. Imagine you had an AI which actually could rove around the entire internet and decide what to learn from. Because there is something called unsupervised learning. It's not such a completely crazy idea as it might sound, which would be an evolution. That would be a hell of an evolution. But I still don't know that we've got understanding at that point.
We are almost out of time, and I'm really tempted to squeeze in a question about your opinions on the TV show Devs, but I feel like that might take quite a long time. So I'm going to say thank you, Tim, and thank you to everyone who's watched. Before you all go, there's no talk next week as we are taking a short break. You can get news on our next talk, which is on Friday the 25th of June, and all our future talks by following us on @PMStudio UK on Twitter, or Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or by subscribing to our newsletter, or even this YouTube channel itself. Give the video a thumbs up before you go. The more subscribers we get, the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Thank you all for watching. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you all again here on the 25th of June at 1 p.m.
Thank you, everybody.